Dr. Neff, it's great to have you back. Thanks for coming and spending some time with us today.
It's great to be back. I really enjoyed our conversation last time, so looking forward to another.
Great. I feel like you've been really busy and have been really producing a lot of great content for a pretty broad audience base at this point. Thank you for
Oh,
doing that.
well, thank you. Thank you for saying so.
Yeah. I want to start, and I really want to talk about your article, The Autistic and ADHD Nervous System, and I want to dive into that. But before we get into that article, can you just help us, for those of us who have been out of a science class for a long time, and help us give a little context on our nervous system and kind of what it does?
Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna try to. I usually do this with visual supports, so I'm gonna try and do this without visual supports, but try to create maybe some images for listeners' minds. So yeah, the nervous system. It's really interesting. I'm seeing it kind of pop up a lot in pop psychology now, which is really cool. And also, yeah, the nervous system is really complex. So when people talk about nervous system regulation, like what are they even talking about? So if we zoom all the way back to like what is the nervous system, I what helps me is to think about it as kind of branches. There's a lot of tree branches that come into it. So we've got the human nervous system, and we've got the central nervous system, and then we've got the peripheral nervous system. This is where visual supports is really helpful. So the central nervous system, that's the brain and the spine. And basically, that's how all information gets up to our brain. So like any sensation we experience is ultimately going to come through the spine to the brain. So for example, I used to work with chronic pain in health psychology, and we actually work a lot with the brain. And sometimes that can confuse folks because it's like, are you saying the pain is in my brain? And it's like, no, no, no. Yes and no, because we don't experience the pain until the pain signal gets to our brain, and that comes through the central nervous system. Anyways, so there's the central nervous system. Then there's the peripheral nervous system. And these are kind of like the messengers that um spring that tree branch out throughout the whole body, which is how we communicate between our body and our brain. So for example, if I'm going to tell myself to pick up this ball right now, um, my brain has to communicate to the neurons in my hand to do that.
Mm.
So the peripheral nervous system is kind of everything beyond the brain and the spine, and it's the messengers of how things get communicated. That branch is also divided into two branches. I don't know if this is the level of detail you were
Yeah,
looking
no,
for.
this is great.
Um, okay. So there's
I'm
the
yeah.
somatic ner nervous system, and that's where I'm like, if I'm gonna pick up this ball, I'm telling my arm to do something. And so there's some element of, control. It's voluntary. Or if I'm gonna, like, drink a glass of water, there's, motor neurons that are being passed through that's telling my body to do that thing. And then there's the autonomic nervous system. This happens on a more involuntary level, right? So this controls things like breath rate, heart rate, and other automatic processes, which is so good it's involuntary, right? Because if we had to tell our heart to beat every time
That would
it
be
needed to
exhausting.
beat, well, we'd be dead. Like
Yeah,
we
yeah.
just couldn't do it. Um, and so when people start talking about nervous system regulation, they're often talking about this branch of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, because this is where a lot of those automatic processes and things like fight, flight, or freeze, this is where they take root. So if we've branched down, that's the tree branch of the nervous system that we're talking about and that we'll be talking about today. And then that also branches the autonomic nervous system into something called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But I'm going to take a pause here before we dive into that. So that's like a big bird eye view of the nervous system.
Perfect. That's exactly what I needed. Um, that was super helpful, and I think really a great refresher for people who haven't paid attention to this in a long time. You mentioned that the autonomic nervous system is the part that's really like we don't think about, right? It just happens.
Mhm.
And that's the part that people talk about a lot when they're saying that they're talking about regulation and dysregulation. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so and that's where that parasympathetic and sympathetic piece comes into play. So the sympathetic branch,
Got it.
I like the metaphor of like it's like the gas pedal. So it's telling our body, okay, we need to mobilize here. Like there's something like right now, I am having a little bit of sympathetic reaction, which is really good because I have a cold and I'm kind of shut down. And it's like, well, to be able to talk to Richie and to be able to put words together, I need a little bit more like adrenaline and a little bit more
Mm,
cortisol to kind of help me do that. So it's actually good that I'm getting a little bit more sympathetic momentum right now. Now, if I was really anxious and I was getting too much of it, then I'd be feeling flooded right now, and that would actually not be helpful. And so sympathetic, it's like the gas pedal. Ideally, our sympathetic can respond like, can kinda hit the gas enough to what the environment needs. When it hits it too much, that's when we might start feeling anxious or irritable or
okay.
stressed out. And so that's where the fight flight lives when it's kind of on full throttle. And then the parasympathetic, this is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest. So this is where our body knows it's safe, and so it can go back to, like, digesting its food. It can prioritize sleep. We need this to be able to fall asleep and to get restful sleep. We need this to give our nervous systems a break because it can't be hitting the gas all the time. And sometimes something that happens is people think like parasympathetic good, sympathetic bad, but it's not good bad. It's ideally our system is working in harmony together so that we can match our environment to whatever like the demand is in front of us. So like I was saying, it's good for me to have a little bit of sympathetic nervous system right now. It's helping me get out of my fog of the head colds to be
Yeah.
able to talk to you.
Well, we appreciate it. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I think that's going around for everybody right now.
I know,
Um,
I know.
myself included. Anyway. Okay, so I'm curious about a couple of things, right? You mentioned the sympathetic response is, it's not good or bad. It just there, too much of it can be a bad thing,
Mhm.
and having it at the right time in the right place can be a good thing. And you used a term called flooding. Can you elaborate what that means?
So yeah, flooding, and that's kind of a casual term, but if it like if I think we can feel flooded if it's too much emotion, too much cortisol, too much adrenaline to where it's not helpful, right? Ideally, we'd have a helpful amount of so adrenaline and cortisol are things that mobilize the body toward action. And that can be good if it's helps sharpen our focus for like an exam or right before maybe a sports event or even a speaking event. But if it's too much of it, then we are maybe shaking and experiencing physical anxiety or physical stress, or our thoughts are racing. And so it's when it's hit that point of it's so much of those hormones and stress that it's not helpful for the situation.
Right, and then that's when I when I used to compete in sports, I'd feel like those would be the times where I'd be like real jittery, or like you mentioned, shaky, or my breathing would change. Right? What are some of the other physical attributes that can go along with that moment of potential
Mhm.
flooding?
Yeah, so heartbeat definitely, will go up, maybe some sweating as well. There's other things that happen physiologically to the body when we go into fight flight. So things like our pupils will actually dilate as a way to take in more information, and it's a safety response of like
Oh,
it
really?
systems like I need more information, give me all the information. Our blood kinda diverts from our digestive tract to our muscles so that we can be, like, faster and stronger. And so, yeah, these are great things if we're about to do a race or if we're being chased by a predator, but they're not so good if it's like I'm sitting in a classroom and I'm overstimulated and now I'm
Mm,
having a like, stress response, and now I have all of this energy in my body, and I'm supposed to be sitting here, and there's no outlet for it.
yeah. Yeah. So is that uh I mean, I'm just envisioning that as you were describing it, you're so great at like communicating in a way that I think is palatable, because for me, I hadn't connected that feeling to that moment, and I just had this idea of feeling super anxious and ready to go and ready to run, as the example you gave, and then being sitting at a desk and taking a math test. And that's just not the right time. That's not the right time for those things to line up. Um,
Uh-uh.
is that
Yeah.
is that a little bit of what autistic individuals and individuals with ADHD can be feeling in those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we so something that I like to highlight is that we tend to have more sensitive nervous systems, meaning that we more easily flipped into a stress state. And that could be that hyperarousal, or it could be a more shutdown state. But when it's that hyperarousal, um, that makes it a lot harder to focus, to be present, and a lot of things can flip that for us. So, for example, sensory overwhelm. So, if sensory overwhelm is causing the nervous system to enter into a stress state, and then the human or the child is trying to focus, that's not well aligned because
Mm.
our prefrontal cortex, we don't have as much access to that when we're in fight, flight, or freeze. It's kind of like it goes offline. So, and because there's so many different there's more triggers for us, it's both that we have a more sensitive nervous system, but then there's more things that trigger our nervous system, right? So sensory overload or cognitive overload, or for me, if I'm giving a presentation and there's a tech mishap or I'm multitasking, that's something that causes my stress to rise pretty quickly. So also just splitting our attention, like getting out of that monotropic focus and splitting our attention can cause stress. So there's also just a lot more triggers that could activate a stress
Mm.
response.
So I'm hearing there's a lot more triggers, and then it's harder to get back to a baseline in
Mhm.
those moments.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanna dive into that a little bit. You mentioned a couple of triggers. What are some other things that people could find triggering, or what are some other moments that could trigger that
Mhm.
stress response?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's like the human ones. So
Mhm.
emotions, um, thought patterns, because our thoughts pair with, our emotions. So some of the internal scripts we might have around like if we make a mistake and narratives of like I'm so incompetent or whatever narratives come up. Social interactions, especially if
Mhm.
they are have a heat to them or there's a miscommunication. So all of that human stuff. But then on top of that, for autistic people, it could be definitely sensory, because sensory is part of the nervous system. So um, sensory overwhelm. But then also some other autistic things would be like unexpected changes to routine and things that kind of when the world goes off script, where this isn't what I had planned and this is what my brain planned for. um, that can cause a stress response in us. Things again, more miscommunication from the cross neurotype stuff or, even the being perceived, and this can become a bit of a spiral, right? Maybe we're starting to get overwhelmed, and then we start stimming, and then people start looking at us weird, and then that brings more emotion, and then we're more flooded. So, it can spiral pretty quickly as well,
Mm.
because our attempts to regulate can bring more unwanted attention.
I'm like this whole thing makes sense to me, right? So you're in a stressful situation. I'm gonna make sure I get this right. Sorry, Dr. Neff, I gotta try.
Yeah, you're good.
We're in a stressful situation. Um, our sympathetic response kind of goes into overdrive, and our autonomic nervous system is doing more than it should be. And now I'm more stressed because I'm also having this internal dialogue, and I'm trying to calm myself down, but maybe I can't do that. And then it's just kind of making the situation bigger and harder to manage.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then we probably also have a narrative going in the back of our head
For
around
sure.
it, which is then and that's where so back to, like, I loosely mentioned the health psychology around, like, there are things that we do around pain because the narratives we have in our head will also send signals of, like, I'm either safe in this moment or I'm not. And if
Mm,
it's, "I'm not safe in this moment," that's an alerting thought. And so the nervous system is like, "Well, I need more information." So in the context of pain, it's like, "Well, I need more information about this pain experience, so let's send out more signals to go collect more information," which means let me go get more sensory input around the pain, and then you're literally receiving more pain signals, and so the pain is magnified. But it's the same thing with stress. If we have an alerting narrative, I'm in danger, I'm being looked at, that's sending to signals to the nervous system. We need to go more into fight flight because we're in danger. So it's not about like reframing our thoughts to try and self manipulate. It's
mhm.
about how do we calm down the nervous system in those spirally moments.
Great. That's a great question. Like, that's a great statement to lead me to my next question, which is like, what do we do in those moments? Like, and
Mhm.
is it different? So, two questions. What do we do in those moments? And is it different for autistic individuals than it is for individuals with ADHD?
I mean, I think there's a lot of practices that kind of work across the board for humans. I did forget to mention for ADHD and for autistic people, executive functioning struggles can be a huge
Mm,
stress trigger.
yep.
And RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria. Um, so I mean, partly it'll be very. I mean, this is a very autistic answer. Like it depends. It depends on the context. But I think knowing I really like to talk a lot about, like, knowing your nervous system states, being able to track where you are, because part of that is knowing, okay, when you're starting to rev up, and then knowing what helps you, and that'll be different for every person. Um, so one of the strategies that's most widely taught, but also gets the biggest eye roll, especially for autistic and ADHD people, is breath work.
Mm.
And the reason breath work is taught so much is because it's you have access to it anywhere. It's it's pretty effective, um, but it can. I think for a lot of people, they hear that and they're like they start tuning out. But the idea of breath work is when we can fill when we can do that slow, deep diaphragmatic breathing, and especially with a slow exhale, that signals to the body like, "Hey, I'm safe now," and it helps activate that parasympathetic response. And breathwork can also be a little bit tricky for some of us, so when it is tricky to get the coordination down, I try to encourage people, just focus on the slow exhale and really slowing that down. So that's one of the things is things like breath work, but also if you know what is triggering you, then you can also perhaps help like, so if it's sensory stuff, can you remove yourself from the stressful situation? Movement and kind of releasing the excess energy, so stimming, frankly, stimming can be really helpful, pacing. Um, let's see. This is where yeah, well, I'll pause there.
Yeah. I'm thinking that like I know we're having this conversation around sort of the autistic individual, but I think this is true for everybody. I'm just taking what you're
Yeah.
sharing and playing it over my experience as a human and the things that I do and right how many times I'm biting my fingernails or pacing around my house or you know going into a meeting that I'm really nervous about the presentation and
Mhm,
now I'm breathing shallower and all those types of things and just revisiting like, oh yeah, the times that I have taken deep breaths, it has helped. And those other things are
mhm,
tools that maybe aren't socially accepted or maybe they are, it depends on the context, but
mhm.
just relating this for all people, not
Yeah,
just
I mean,
some people.
nervous system regulation, it's good for all humans, and then it can be a little bit trickier for autistic people, but yeah, nothing so I talk about nervous system stuff a bit, and nothing I say, like, is specific. I mean, I talk about the specific stressors for autistic people, but otherwise nothing I say is exclusive to autistic people. It's just people with a nervous system.
Right.
So absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
There was something you mentioned and we kind of glossed over it. So I want to go back for just a moment if we
Mhm,
can. You mentioned hyperarousal, and I think in your article you also talk about hypoarousal. Can
mhm.
you just walk us through the difference between the two?
Yeah, so hyperarousal, that's that more fight flight, mobilized for action. So we can think predator like fleeing or a animal like fleeing from a predator. Shutdown is when we're more in like if we think dissociated state, foggy. The again, if we're gonna draw from nature, the nature metaphors might be an animal might go into extreme shutdown when they have been caught by a predator and they are about this is sad when they're about to die because it's partly like you'll have less less receptors to pain when we're in a dissociated
Mm,
state. It's it's almost like the brain saying I've taken in too much and I'm just going to fog out and like dole out the sensations. And so I talk about it as kind of feeling like a dreamlike state or feeling like life just feels less real. We tend to move slower when we're in it. I spend a lot of time actually more in hypoarousal than I do hyperarousal. And that was something I didn't understand about my experience until I understood I was autistic. I didn't understand why like, I would move through the world just feeling like I wasn't in my experience, especially when I was in, like, big social events, and now I realize I can look back and say I was in a shutdown state, I was in hypoarousal, and so that's like the body is putting on the brakes, um, it's kinda putting on the emergency brakes would be, I guess, the metaphor.
That's great. I've heard hyper and hypo in the past used for hyper and hyposensitive, for from some sensory needs and some I've heard that in the past, but I hadn't heard this context before. So I appreciate you sharing that a little bit.
Mhm,
My understanding from your article is that in between the hyper arousal and the hypoarousal state, excuse me, is a place called the window of tolerance.
mhm.
Can you
Yeah, and that oh,
share? Yeah, please share all that you
mhm.
can about that.
Yeah, and that concept comes from, Daniel Siegel, and it's the idea of that's the ideal window of when we can, regulate the stressors coming in. It's that ideal window of arousal when we can, and again, it's matched to the environment or the situation we're in. So we can be engaged, we can be present, and we can be responsive to incoming stressors without being in a stress state. So I think we feel the most authentically engaged when we're in that window of tolerance.
I think I used the term baseline earlier, and that's how I've heard it described before. But it sounds like that's the state where this is the time where you're ready for the math test. You're ready for going into a new place that you've ever been before. You're ready for whatever may come your way. And then you can
Hmm.
kind of, depending on the situation, go in either direction from there or stay in the window of tolerance.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then some of us will have a bigger window of tolerance and some of us will have a more narrow one. Autistic and ADHD folks, I think, tend to have a more narrow window of tolerance. So, meaning, for like if I was to take me and my spouse, for example, it would take a lot more stressors to flip him into a stress state than it would me because his window of tolerance, frankly, is just a lot bigger than mine. And so I like to I like to let people know about that because I think that can help guide some self-compassion. Because sometimes I think we can look at ourselves and be like, "Oh my goodness, why am I struggling so much? Or why am I having such a big reaction?" And it's like, it's part of the autonomic nervous system, like, your nervous system didn't choose. It just flipped into a stress state and, like, sorry, that sucks for you.
Right. It wasn't like you said, "Oh, I know. I think I'll do this." Right? These are things
Mhm.
that happen outside of your control. I
Yeah,
think that's really
yeah.
interesting. Something you just said about you and your husband, and I'm curious how some of those conversations go and how other people can be having those conversations. Certainly, when we're young and we're trying to understand ourselves, right? Maybe asking for that help, but then as we get older, how do we? Is this self advocacy? What does this look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely connected to self-advocacy, and it's something I talk a lot about with, just neurodiverse families in general, how important it is to create shared language for everyone's neurology and differences, and so I think creating language around this and again, Daniel Siegel has some good work around this. Daniel Siegel doesn't do stuff specifically on autism or ADHD, but he does a lot with, like, childhood and nervous system. He's got a metaphor of flipping the lid, which is where when a child loses access to like prefrontal cortex because they've entered a stress state, and he's got like a hand metaphor he uses for it. And so, depending on the age of the children, there's different language that we can introduce that helps explain, like, yeah, when your body, flips the lid, this happens. And then how do we close the lid? And as we get older, we can start introducing more sophisticated language, perhaps. But part of that just becomes part of the shared language of the family and education around normalizing. We've got nervous systems and things happen. And how do we talk about it when they happen? And how do we also talk about, um, like, how to close the lid, how to come back to ourselves, and how to come back to connection if there has been a disconnection that's happened in a stress state?
Yeah, I think that was some of what we talked about the last time you were here, which was just making sure that the neurodivergent families continue to have the conversation and
Mhm.
that they're continuing to create their sense of community and making sure that the people that are in the circles know the terminology and know how to offer support when they need it. And that way individuals can ask for help, not just from parents or parental units, but from anyone in their community.
Yeah, 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 exactly.
So then, I'm curious, I've heard some people online talking about this article, and I feel like there's more and more happening with people calling attention to the work that you're doing. That's just an observation that I've had. Congratulations on that. Good for you,
Mhm.
and excited to hear that. What's something that you're hoping that people can take away from this article in particular, and how they can use it as a tool for themselves or for their families?
Yeah, I think so much about the autistic and ADHD experience is about coming to understand oneself or coming to understand one child and understanding our brains, understanding our nervous system. And I think, especially for autistic people, I think for a lot of us, understanding why something is happening is really important for many of us. And it's one of the things that helps increase agency over our bodies because I often experience my body as a place of too much, and I think that's why I was so drawn to psychology because the more I can wrap concepts in education and be like, "Okay, well, that's my nervous system doing that." That's one of the things that helps ground me and regroup me. So and I've lost the thread of your question, but I think it was
Oh, that's
something
okay.
about my
Yeah.
hopes for my work, and I think I hope that people can engage it in a way that helps them to learn about, like, their brain style and their nervous system style in a way where they can align more of their life with it and work with it versus working against it. And that it also unlocks some compassion and gentleness of like, "Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense that I struggle with this, or it makes sense that I do this. This is harder for me. This is a harder lift for me."
Yeah. Again, I'm taking this insight and relaying it to my personal self, and just thinking that historically I've always been very much of an extrovert, and I've noticed myself over the last couple of years that I just need more time on the couch, kind of vegging out, relaxing, maybe taking a nap, whatever that may be. And I just think that it's part of it is when I travel and go and see, different cities, there's the stressor of the airport and being on the airplane and the parking and all those things. And then I don't get a chance to relax until I'm at home in my safe place. And then that's where I
Mhm,
need to like sort of, I don't know how to describe it, melt into the couch, right? And
mhm,
that's the time where I'm recognizing that as you're describing it, I'm in that hypoarousal state, and that I need to be in that space, and that helps prevent me from getting to a burnout place. Um, and so again, just taking the conversation of what you're sharing and kind of overlaying it into my experience in my life. Um,
mhm.
I mentioned burnout. Can you talk a little bit about burnout and how, if people aren't paying attention to their own nervous systems, that they'll experience burnout and maybe some of the symptoms of burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. So burnout, and there's different kinds of burnout, but one thing that all burnouts have in common is it's a burnout of the nervous system. It's the nervous system kind of pushing too hard and too hard for too long. And so when we're in burnout, one of the things we can do that's really supportive is to support our nervous system and find practices that help support that. Um, Different kinds of burnout. There's parental burnout. One that's getting talked a lot about right now is autistic burnout because there's some kind of unique flavors to it. And I think our experience of it is a bit more intense. With autistic burnout, some of the core features are so our sensory sensitivities can increase. So even if our baseline sensitivities are a lot to handle during burnout, it can be much more intense. So we might also be having more like sensory shutdowns and sensory meltdowns. Our autistic traits will become more noticeable, the kind of harder autistic traits. So things like routine disruptions could be much more dysregulating. And so this is a common time for some folks to get diagnosed actually, because during burnout, sometimes the autism, especially if someone's an autistic person who masks, the autism will often be more evident during burnout. There can be some quote unquote, I don't love the terminology, but like skill regression or just loss of skills. So our executive functioning can struggle. Someone who at one point was maybe functioning like very well in a work environment can go to struggling with like their basic activities of daily living. Like I've seen really wild crashes in functioning around burnout and just what a person's able to kind of how they're able to move through their day and get things done. And then the fatigue. It's just like huge
Yeah.
wall of emotional and physical fatigue that's pretty pervasive. Those are kind of the core components of autistic burnout, and that comes from the work of, Dora Raymaker and they put they did a study on this that was published, I think in 2020 or 2021, which really helped put autistic burnout on the clinical map.
That's that's so insightful. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the adults that I work with, and to your excuse me, to your point, some of the skill regression or the executive functioning. It's like I need help with this, whatever it is, and it's something. It's like
Mhm.
I've seen you do this 100 times. Like, how come today it is? And as an
Uh-huh.
educator, I've got to be more aware of. Great, there's more happening than just this moment for this individual, and making sure that I check in on all fronts.
Yeah, and it can be really confusing. It can be confusing for the person and for the
Mm,
people around us because it's, "Well, you could do this last week. Like, why can't this?" Or for ourselves of like, "I used to be able to do this, and now I can barely, like, get up and shower and take care," like and so that can lead to a lot of anxiety and also a lot of
mm,
depression and a lot of, kinda self-depreciating narratives for a lot of us. And it's just a really helpless feeling to be like, "I know I used to be able to do this, and now, like, my brain and body just won't cooperate, or I don't have the energy to do it."
sorry for the silence. I'm just trying to write down as much
No,
of this as I can.
silence
Um,
and pauses are fine.
yeah, I think that's so. I just see this spiraling that can happen in these moments, and you start to feel that, and then you start to communicate that to yourself, and then it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then it becomes true, and then that just sort of feeds that
Mhm.
cycle again for the next iteration.
Well, and then we're back to nervous system stuff, and this is
Mhm.
where, like, I know it depends, I'm not sure kind of what circles they're in, but I know in some autistic spaces, CBT can kind of be frowned on, a lot of things around changing our thoughts, and I do think it has to be so careful
Yeah.
when we do that with autistic people, but this is where, so sometimes people can be skeptical of practices that are about addressing our thought patterns, but this is where it is so important because what you were just saying of then we start telling ourselves something about, um, kind of how bad we are, and that
Sure.
activates the "I'm not safe," and
Ah,
then the nervous system is off and running. So when we can communicate messages of safety to our nervous system and how we talk to ourselves, that is one of the things that's actually gonna help us get through burnout and help us have more resilience. And so I actually don't love the term self-compassion. The first time I heard it, I was like, "No." And I
hmm,
don't like most bullet point self-compassion statements. So I like to this is another place I like to do some education of self-compassion can be as simple as I'll place a hand on my chest and I'll say, "This is a hard moment." And that's self-compassion because 'cause I'm being with myself
mhm.
compassionately in that. So if I'm starting to spiral on a negative narrative, I might pause and interrupt it and say like, "Whew, that's a rough narrative, Megan Anna. Like, this is a hard moment." I'm not gonna try and be like, "No, you're not all those things that your mind is telling you," because then I'll just get into a fight with myself, and that'll make me more fight flighty. But if I can just ground and name, "This is a hard moment," that kind of self-compassion is accessible to me. Whereas if I was trying to convince myself to believe something else, like, that's typically not very helpful.
Mm. Which is, I think, highlights the importance of something you said earlier, which is knowing yourself, knowing your body, understanding your own trigger points, for lack of a better word, and what works for you. I think is really important in all of this work and in all of this process for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For everybody. And so it'll look different. So think like big words like self-compassion will look different for everyone
Mm,
or yeah, absolutely.
mm.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Neff, I think one thing that happens is we get into these moments of stress, and then it's like, oh, I'm just going to take 10 deep breaths, and then it's going to be all better, and I'll be back to, back in my window of tolerance, and everything's okay. But it doesn't always work that way, does it?
It doesn't, and it took me a while of kind of talking about this and teaching nervous system stuff before I identified this and started naming it. But one thing that I started noticing when we start bringing awareness to anything, and that could be bringing awareness to our thought patterns or bringing an awareness to our nervous system, it can be really easy. And I think perhaps autistic people might be especially vulnerable to this to enter into what I call fix it energy, which is like, okay, I'm having this thought. This thought's going to stress me out. Now I need to fix it. Or I'm in a stress state. Let me fix it. And what that brings is, well, it tends to bring a kind of constricted energy, a bit of evaluation that's in there. Like, right, this is good. This is bad. There's some judgment in there. And so that constricted, fix it, evaluative energy is actually tapping into our stress response or will make us more
Mm,
stressed. And so one of the things that I like to teach is and this is easier said than done. It takes practice, but it's how do I turn toward myself with openness, with curiosity, with a expansive energy, not a restricted energy or not a constricted energy. And so what that looks like tangibly, when I can notice I'm in a stress state from a more expansive space, it looks like leaning in with curiosity of being like, wow, that's important information. Okay. There's some things happening in my environment that are stressing me out. And then from a place of care, being able to ask, like, what would I like to do about it? And so it's coming more from a place of agency and care and not, this is bad. I need to get out of this. I need to fix it. But it's, okay, I think that I'm going to go pace around the neighborhood to get some of this energy out. And if that after that, maybe I'll come home and put some stim music on and a weighted blanket, and I will see how that feels. And it's a different way of narrating for myself how I'm gonna move through that, and it's about trying to get myself into a more comfortable space. It's not about, like, "Let me fix this bad thing." And so, approaching our nervous system with curiosity, with care, with non-judgment, kind of observing, like a more descriptive, I'm observing myself. And in general, just the more we can approach ourselves from that energy, I think the softer we are with ourselves, which communicates more safety, which helps with nervous system stuff.
so more like supporting through the moment instead of trying to correct the moment, or supporting through
Oh,
the emotion instead of
yeah.
trying to correct it, right?
Supporting I love how you just took my, like, very context heavy thing and, like, said it in one sentence. That was amazing. What did you
Thank
say?
you.
Support us through the moment instead of fix it? Or you said
Yeah.
it better.
I don't know if I said it better, but I think I
Uh-huh.
said support us through the emotion, not trying to correct the emotion, or support us
That
through the
was
moment, not trying to fix the moment.
that was really good.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, that's it.
You can take it and use it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, again, selfishly just thinking like, all right, I'm going to relax on the couch. Okay, I did that. Well, now I should feel better, and I don't. And okay, great. I'm going to do the next 10 things on my checklist,
Mhm.
my quote unquote checklist to feel better. And if at the end of it, I don't feel better, then I'm even more stressed than I was when I started, because it's not, again, it's not working. And
Yes, yes, exactly, and that's the same thing we can take with, like, the breath work or any relaxation response is like, "Okay, I'm gonna take 3 deep breaths, not working, now I'm more stressed." So it's like we almost need to take a step back of, "Okay, I'm gonna try some things to support myself in this moment," but r also with, like, releasing the, "It's to fix and get out of this." Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So we've talked about a couple of strategies that people can use and that you've used and that others have used. What are some other places that people can look for support?
Um, yeah, so can we narrow down the bucket a little bit? Because that's a
Sure.
big it's
Yeah.
a big uh-huh. Like, 'cause there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah. No, I guess I'm just thinking of people who are trying to understand themselves and trying to understand their nervous system and how it's responding to different situations. And maybe they've asked a few people, and maybe, I don't know if there
Mhm,
are books that they should be reading or other.
mhm,
You mentioned a couple of authors who have talked about a few things, just if there are tools that people could be using to help them
mhm.
get in touch with themselves a little bit and have a better understanding.
Yes, absolutely. So, probably depends on learning style.
You
If you like visuals and if people click with my learning style, they could check out the Autistic Burnout Workbook because there's that chapter in the nervous system or my free resources online. There are a few other books in the autism space. I don't have the names in front of me that have talked about the autistic nervous system, and it's interesting because there can be actually a variance of there's how affirming it is. Some people talk about it in kind of a weird way, like cure the nervous system, cure the autism. I don't love that
know.
rhetoric. But there are a few books out there that are specifically on autism in the nervous system. I haven't read them myself, but I know they exist.
Yeah.
So that's a resource. If you are a video person, Crash Course, just nervous system basics. Crash Course has, I think, a series on the nervous system and has some good videos. The Khan Academy is another one that has some good education videos on nervous system. So if just learning about nervous system basics is
Mhm.
helpful. And I believe I've linked to some of those videos like in the article that you mentioned.
Great.
Um, and oh, I have a workbook on the nervous system. I literally have I have yeah, I have a workbook on the nervous system. Oh my gosh, it's for sale on my website, um, which talks about all of this stuff. And there's a lot of, like, nervous system coaches out there, but it's become of this pop psychology thing, and that's where I get a little
Uh,
bit nervous. Um some practices, and I like, always people should decide what's best for their own medical team. I personally have had a lot, and my children as well, have had a lot of positive impact from cranial sacral work, which connects to nervous system. So there's some kind of alternative medicine type things that more directly work on the nervous system. I use the Sensate, which I love, which is a vagal nerve stimulator. So it stimulates the vagus nerve, which helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Um, the Safe and Sound Protocol by Dr. Porges, it has an impact on the nervous system as well. That's part of why it's thought to be supportive. That's that's a protocol that is kind of one of those more body-based protocols that some people might have interest in. So
that's
those are
great.
some of the things.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I love that you and others are just calling attention to this at this point. I think that's big.
It is because it's a big Dr. Donna Henderson talks about autism being a distinct nervous system, and I really appreciate that language. Like, it's about so much more than social communication. It's we have a unique nervous system that interacts with the world differently, and I'm really glad people are starting to pay attention to that aspect of the autistic experience.
Dr. Neff, that was so informative. I felt like for lack of a better term, drank from the fire hose, just trying to capture all of what you're describing. Where can people remind everybody where they can find your work, and particularly your one of your newest articles?
Mhm. Yes, so, neurodivergentinsights.com is our website, and we've got lots and lots of articles on things like nervous system, sensory. And the Autistic Burnout Workbook just came out, and there's a chapter in there on the nervous system. So if, kind of tactile, interactive material is best for people, that's a, print workbook that's interactive. And then also on social media, Neurodivergent Insights, and then co-host the podcast Divergent Conversations. That's more adults, geared more for adults, but we also share information on the autistic ADHD experience there. So those are the main places.
Great. We'll make sure that all of those get into our show notes for everyone. Thank you so
Well,
much for
thank
being
you.
here, and thank you for your continued work. It's so appreciated.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.